I am honored to introduce our next speaker, Ellen Chisa. She is founder in residence at Boldstart. She co-founded darklung.com, a programming language coupled to its editor and infrastructure. Hello, Ellen. We are happy to have you.
Hello. I am so excited to be here today for Craft. I had originally hoped to join all of you in Hungary in person in 2020, but we all know how the last year has worked out. But it's great that since we're doing this online, I'm sure we can have many more of us here. I'm joining you from my house in Boston, so it's morning here. I know it's afternoon for some of you and really early for people on the West Coast. But I'm excited to talk at a conference named Craft about how we can build effective developer experience, since so many of us are people who care about our craft and what we're building. You got a bit of background before, but part of why I care about this so much is right now I'm a founder in residence at Boldstart. We're a seed stage first check investor. We often invest before people have built anything at all. And that means I spend a lot of my time with technical founders who are looking to build products for the enterprise, often for other technical users, and think about how we can make those experiences even better. Before this, I really started thinking about this problem when we were building Dark, when I was there as the CEO, co-founder, and de facto engineering manager, which meant I spent a lot of time thinking both about the tooling we were building for people outside of Dark and also for the environment our engineering team had internally. And before that, I worked at a bunch of different companies, Lola, travel company, Kickstarter, and Microsoft on product. To be fair, most of the examples I'm going to give you today are from my time working on Dark, because I think that's the time I spent the most time thinking about developer experience. And one thing that I found really interesting was when we started building Dark, we started looking at all of the other tools the developers were using to see how they positioned themselves and what they were thinking of. I went through 100+ different tools that engineers use to accomplish their daily work. You've probably seen like the cloud native map of how many things we have the option to use. And across infrastructure products, applications, connectors, tooling that we used, pretty much every single tool used one of 4 words: easier, faster, automatic, or simple. And this, when you think about it, it kind of makes sense. A pretty famous report Stripe released in 2018 was the developer coefficient. And they spent a lot of time breaking down how important engineering work is to our economy and how much time we lose when our tooling is bad, and thus how much money we lose, because anytime we lose time, we're also effectively losing some amount of opportunity cost of what we could do. And so from this angle, from a business standpoint, like, yeah, I guess making it easier and faster makes sense. But I think from another angle, it doesn't. So I want to pause for a second, and I want each of you to think of the last time you had a really great time programming something. And I guess this is a fair time to caveat. I'm not saying that we all have to be only passionate about programming. We all have to do it in all of our free time. You can just enjoy something while you're doing it at work. So a time you were having a good experience while writing code. Hopefully you have one in mind, but in case you don't, I'll share mine and you can decide if it resonates for you. The first one that comes up for me is it was a live coding demo where I was using Dark and I was showing how you could connect to a GCP storage bucket. So if you wanted to store, say, a bunch of images in GCP, but then still run the majority of your backend code in Dark. And what I liked about this was I knew how to do it. I already had some familiarity with Dark and the tools that I was using. I knew how to use the editor. I knew how to use the language. The GCP documentation was pretty good. So I felt like I could kind of mechanically make progress towards it. And so the whole time I was doing this, I actually completely forgot that I was doing it live for other people, because I was just enjoying the experience of building the connector, seeing myself put information into GCP, get it back out, and having that. Kind of think of it as being like the cat. You're just typing and things are happening and you're getting there. And so what I really like about this is it's a state in which you're completely focused and concentrated on what you're doing. You're kind of outside of your reality. You know what needs to happen next. You feel like it's doable. You want to do the work for the sake of doing it. And like, that's not every work. Sometimes you have something that you're trying to debug and it's a huge slog, but the best days are the ones that feel like this. And there's a psychological term for this. It's like a psychologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, has described this as the best moments in our lives occur when our body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult or worthwhile. And so he calls this idea being in a flow state. And if you think about it from the perspective of people who like to write software, it makes sense. Hopefully you have your own story, or you can at least anchor on mine. Or if you think about how some people get into programming, it's a sort of thing where maybe you had a manual task and you're supposed to copy paste something a bunch of times and you're like, I don't want to do that, which is technically easy. So if we wanted it to be easy, copy pasting would be fine. And you decided to write a script instead, which is more difficult, often actually ends up taking longer than the copy pasting would have, but feels worthwhile. And so this is the state we're going for. I really like to use this diagram to explain it. This particular version of the flow state diagram is from the book, The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell. It's a great book. It has a lot of different lenses for thinking about how to build software. But it's the idea that you want to make sure the skill you have and the challenge you are addressing are at the same level. So you want to, as you gain more skills in a technology, have something be more challenging. And when something's way too hard, you end up in this experience of anxiety of, I don't know if I can do it. This is, I don't know, I'm unsure, I am worried, I'm not having fun, I'm afraid of failure. Or on the flip side, if things are too easy, which is what a lot of our developer positioning would lead you to believe, you just get bored. You don't really want to do it. It's not engaging. It's when you build exactly the same thing again at the fourth job and you're like, okay, I'm tired of building this same, say, checkout flow or whatever it is. And so neither of these states are great. We want to be in that middle flow channel. I like this Elle Woods from Legally Blonde gift for this. We want to be able to do the thing that's hard. We want to know it's hard, but we still want to look at someone else and be able to go like, what? This was hard. I just knew how I was going to be able to do it. We like to do the hard things that we were already good at. So hopefully this has given you at least some basis for accepting this premise with me, which is when we're thinking about effective developer experience, we're thinking about flow. And so I have, as we go forward and talk about more ways to achieve flow over the next 20, 25 minutes, that if you're building a developer tool, you can think about how this applies to what you're building. Or if you're just here because you like to learn and you're thoughtful about your tooling, you can use this as another way to think about the tools you're adopting or how you're teaching yourself more things. How do we do this? I'm going to give you two ways to frame this. So the first one is thinking about the timing of tooling adoption and when in the stage of adoption a developer is as they're starting to use the tool. If you've spent some time in the business world or on the product side of things, you might look at this and go, it's kind of like AARRR, but different. So instead of saying it's acquisition, activation, retention, referral, revenue, I'm not really concerned about revenue from the perspective of developer engagement. I'm thinking more of the personal journey of building software. And I've added awareness to the front because a lot of the times with developer tooling, I'm sure all of you have seen this, we've probably seen tools today and yesterday in the conference where we've gone, oh, that's kind of neat. I don't have anything I need that for right now, but I'm going to file it away in my catalog as a technology I might like to learn or work with in the future. So I think awareness from that perspective is very important as well. So we're going to go through each of these steps of the journey and talk about some techniques for keeping people in flow at each of them. And then the second one I want to talk about is who is responsible for creating this effective developer experience in tooling. Far too often when I talk to people and they say, oh, we're going to care about Devex now. We're going to hire the Devrel person and they're going to solve all of our problem and they're going to think about the experience. And this really isn't the case. When you think about how long the journey is and how many people work at a company, almost every single role has a place in figuring out how to create a developer experience that's effective. I'm pretty sure I've written down every single job description that I have ever also worked with. If I missed yours, I'm sorry. I'm sure there's something in here that you can tie to that you will also be able to do to improve developer experience. But it's everyone from marketing and sales to community to developer relations to the engineers who are working on the team to technical writers. So with that, let's go through these 6 parts of the journey. The first part of the journey that I want to mention is the awareness stage. Like I said, this is going to be at the very beginning of the flow state. This is before you're even really aware of something. So I think there's a couple things to keep in mind for making this not too difficult. You don't want something that appears impossible to learn. It's really easy when you're someone who works on something and you're passionate about the space to get all the details in there up front. but we've all had that experience where we look at something and go, oh man, that seems cool, but that is like way over my head. I have no idea how I would even get started. That's for people who are way smarter than me. And so what you want to do is you want to instead be thinking about, okay, how are we going to make this something where when someone hears this first awareness of the tool, they can file it away as something that might be approachable for them to solve a problem in the future? Or it could also be that you want people to gain awareness about your tool at the right moment when they actually have a place to use it. So a few techniques for working on this. First, content strategy is a great one. There are two things I will share about this. So the first one is you can do a content strategy around a few big hits. We did a piece like this for Dark, which I think I'm trying to remember the number of milliseconds, but it was how to deploy in 50 milliseconds or less. And that's the sort of headline that gets a bunch of people to read something and get excited and generates broad awareness, but doesn't necessarily hit on people who are going to build something right now. The second side of it is you can do smaller things that are targeted and will be more immediately useful, but will take longer to build. So an example of that would be, say, how to use Dark to build Slack bots, where it's super useful. And if someone is trying to build a Slack bot, they can pick it up and immediately find it useful, but there's a much smaller audience that will hit. If you are going with that second strategy, I highly recommend hitting a regular cadence so you'll continue to engage with people over time. And one other thing I will leave you with there that I really like, this is from Adam Duvander, who does a lot of work in developer marketing and developer relations. He talks about the developer mind trick. And this is the idea that it's really helpful to write content around how you would solve a problem, because then someone finds the content, reads about how they would have to build the solution themselves, and then decides to use your tool instead. More places that you can engage, events, conferences, meetups. We're all here right now. You can decide which communities you want to be able to join, and that can help people get that exposure early on so they can continue to engage. You can join existing communities and decide which technologies or which groups that exist already might align well with what you're trying to build. So you're giving people a hook in, or you can build your own community to allow people to participate. We'll get into that a little bit more later when we're thinking about referral. And truthfully, depending on how far along your organization is, as much as we like to say, and I personally feel like I don't like being sold to, ads and cold outreach do sometimes work as well. And so when you're thinking about that very first step of flow and getting people into the awareness so they can even start that journey with you, there are a whole bunch of roles within the company who does this. It's not just Referral. It could be your marketing team. It could be a community team. It could be founders. It could be, if you're doing content, it could be technical writers. And so this is the first place where the developer experience really becomes a place that everyone can touch. Once you get someone to be aware of your tool, it's activation when they decide to actually start to use it. So if we're going to put this on our helpful chart, this is when they're at the beginning. They don't really know anything about it, and anything will be relatively challenging if it doesn't have the right thing. And so you want to make sure that they successfully onboard, because you're never going to retain them if they don't have a good first run experience. So sometimes people call this first run experience or out of the box experience in consumer. So one thing to keep in mind, particularly for Flow, is the idea of the learning styles that people might be coming into your product with. In our work with Dark, this was programming language specific, so it might be a little bit different for your use case, but we found that there were 3 primary ways people wanted to learn, and having something that matched the learning style really helped with it not feeling overwhelming. So the first one was a set of people who wanted to read all of the documentation before getting started. The second one were people who had a de facto project they came in with, either like a recipe app or a to-do app or a Project Euler problem they like to solve, or FizzBuzz. So they have like a stock project they build with every new technology. Or there were people who wanted to take something that already worked and tear it down. I think these were the only 3 I saw. If you have a different learning style, I would love to hear about it. Like, send me an email after. And so what we saw was, if we were mismatched on this, what would happen was the challenge would be so high because the person didn't have the ability to learn the way they wanted to, and also didn't have any skills in the technology, that they would often fail. Of course, learning style mismatch isn't the only thing that can make a first run experience too hard. So chances are, if it's too hard, you're probably seeing things like people bouncing before they get to the key action, or they don't see the value quickly enough, and so they churn too fast, or you get lots of people who say they're excited, lots of tweets, lots of GitHub stars, but people not really actually managing to use the product. And that might indicate that it's a little bit too hard to get started. So there's a few ways you can tweak your experience to lower this challenge and make it easier. First one, make sure you understand that if you're asking someone to unlearn something, that is actually much, much harder than asking them to learn something for the first time. And so it's worth sitting down and saying, is there anything where I'm asking my user to make a big cognitive leap from what they've done before? An example of this in Dark is the language itself was functional. And so people who are coming from a functional language background were totally fine. People who had not programmed much and were kind of like stumbling their way through were also fine. But people who had a strong imperative background had a lot harder time. And I think that's not Dark specific. That's often a shift people go through when they're looking at functional languages for the first time. But there are a lot of other concepts like that, and unlearning is really hard. Other techniques you can use to make things feel less hard. You can anchor on a familiar experience. So even if you're doing something different, it will feel common to the user. And so they'll feel like they have that expertise from other tools they've adopted. For instance, working from a CLI is a really common onboarding experience. Another one is connecting really hard to an existing skill, such as a language. Like there's a reason there's a lot of getting started with X tool in Ruby, getting started with X tool in Python. Since we anchor so much on the skills we already have, that helps. And then a third option is connecting to another existing workflow or tool and saying, hey, if you're already using tool A, tool B like fits right in with that. And that, again, helps people to feel as though they have a little bit more skill. And so you can see in all three of those, we're not necessarily, like in addition to bringing the challenge down, we're also kind of making you rely more on the skills that you have. And so that allows us to bring the challenge level further down. Now, I started by saying, we don't want this to be too easy. And so too easy, I think, is actually potentially a worse problem than too hard, particularly because lots of us enjoy challenging things. I think with developers, you get a little more like willing to beat your head against the wall to learn something if you think it's cool enough, but too easy tends to just like cause people's eyes to glaze over and for them to move on. Again, it's like do you want to write a bunch of stuff in a spreadsheet or do you want to write a script? And so an example of this from Dark was we had these data stores that were native to the language, and you just clicked like add data store and it immediately appeared. This was too easy for people. There was the feeling that it shouldn't have been that quick and it couldn't possibly be real, and it really undermined credibility in the idea that you would want to store any data in Dark. Again, this isn't programming language specific. Another example of this that you can think through is Kayak, the meta-search travel engine. When it came out, most people were accustomed to going to each airline website and searching for the cheapest deal, looking across all of them and picking it. And so that's not how meta-search backends work. If you've worked on a travel product, you know you get back all the flights at once. But for people to trust in the results, they wanted to feel like Kayak was searching each of the airlines the same way they would. And so Kayak actually implemented a delay and then had this little flippy carousel thing that would say it was searching each airline one by one. And that drastically increased credibility. Taking that concept back to our data storage example, there's an app, Railway app, that does a similar thing. I'll let this GIF loop a few times. But what happens is when you say you're creating a data store, it actually runs through a couple things. It takes a little bit longer. And so it feels more like it's a real data store because it took some time to do this. You can also see at the end here, to our point before about anchoring to another tool, it then prompts you into a CLI experience. So this is a nice job of making it both hard enough and then also easy enough to continue. So when we're thinking about building experiences that are not too easy, we want them to feel believable. And we also want them to be capturing a meaningful chunk of work that makes the person feel like they actually achieved something, not just like, oh, okay, I clicked a button and now I'm done, which doesn't give that same feeling of reward or like you've actually met a challenge. So you can see that's what gets you back up here in the flow channel. And so as we've talked through these, hopefully you've seen a couple ways the different roles could play into this. If you have a user researcher on your team, that is definitely the sort of person who should be looking at someone's first run experience and going, oh, like every single user when they create a database is unhappy because they feel like it wasn't hard enough. When you're thinking about all of these pieces being built, that goes to the development team who likely have opinions about how the onboarding should work or what tools they want to anchor to based on their own experience. You can see how design fits in here or similar depending on your stage of company, founders or product managers. Activation is something that can't just be about DevRel. It has to be about the core product experience. Building on that, assuming a user successfully activates and starts to work with your product, you have to then think about their continued usage. Usage, retention, and learning have some similarities, but I'm going to walk through why I've broken them apart. With usage, this is you've gotten past that initial experience, you've onboarded, it wasn't too easy, it wasn't too hard, you want to keep going. And so I think the biggest thing here to help people be successful is a concept called progressive disclosure. This one I would put firmly in the design bucket. It's a design concept. Design researchers talk about it a lot. But it's the idea that you don't want to overwhelm by sharing all of the information at once. So imagine you went through that onboarding, like great onboarding, customized, and then suddenly you're in, say, Photoshop, and you have everything in Photoshop available to you all at once with no sense of what's important. It's going to be really overwhelming. And so progressive disclosure is this idea that even after you've been through that initial onboarding, you want to be able to learn things step by step, not everything. This can be challenging with developer products because we do all want to have a lot of control and fidelity over the way we're using our tool, but it has to come gradually. And so the other thing this does is introducing new concepts over time also helps to prevent boredom because people find more things that they can do and they can deepen their expertise in the tool. In conjunction with this progressive disclosure, you also have to think about learning. So one of the things that's interesting about tools that are for people who practice a craft or who are experts, their skills are growing over time, both in the tool and overall. And so you keep moving up this flow channel. It's not like, I don't know, I'm not still getting better at my email, pretty successful at email now. But with some of our professional tooling, we expect to keep growing for years and years and years and years. And so I kind of think of that as being in the middle of this channel here. And the best option we have for doing this often in developer tooling is around our error messages and documentation. This is super important. First of all, good error messages allow users to solve their own problem. They make it clear what's going on. And in conjunction with good documentation, it also enables the user to find their own solution. And so this piece of learning and these two particular angles, I think of as really being the zone of excellence for developers and technical writers working together. And this is a part of the experience, like most error messages. I'm sure you've had this before, where you're using a product and you just get an error message. It's like unknown error. And that's the sort of thing where like it came up and someone added it and it's not actually very helpful. But most of the time, a designer or PM or anyone else in the company isn't going to see enough of those edge cases or catch every single error. And so that's where developers really have a big impact on other developers' experiences. And same thing with the documentation. Documentation is really a core part of the experience. It's not like a nice to have. I'm a person who doesn't read manuals at all for like physical appliances, but for something where you are encountering these problems and you are learning over time, it is absolutely key and worth investing the time in when you are thinking about your developer experience. Then lastly of that trifecta is the idea of retention. Since developers are apt to keep learning new tools and we're kind of like everyone's out there trying to get our awareness for new things, it's really important if you want to build a good experience and keep people there to invest in the things that are actually sticky. And so this is kind of the idea of like, what's going to happen? Like you've kind of topped out at everything you can learn about this tool, but you still want the person to keep using it rather than being willing to switch to something else because they're bored. And going back to what we said before about progressive disclosure, this is where that full range of options comes. One of the best ways to keep people in flow at the end of this cycle is by giving them options for customization. There's a reason we like sharing our editor themes, and we all have our really particular setups for how we have our monitor and how we have our microphone and everything like that. We like to customize and make sure it is an optimally efficient thing, which is a type of flow to be in. And so making that personal optimization and investment is something that creates a great experience that is apt to retain people even later in their journey. And when we think about the roles that play in here, there's a whole bunch of them. One I really want to call out because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this. People will think of developer relations, developer evangelism, and developer advocacy as being the same role. I put advocacy here in customization because advocacy, the insinuation of the title, is that person will also come back into the company and encourage shifts in the product that are going to help users both users who are getting started, maybe the activation stage, but I think it's particularly important for when you have a strong community of users already and you want to be able to service them as they continue to grow in using your tool. And so again, lots of different roles play in here, not just a dev role, could be a dev advocacy, could be product management and design, founders, executives, users themselves requesting things that they want to be able to customize. And lastly, the thing that brings us full circle. Developers like to learn new tools, and we also like to share them with other people. And so I don't think of this as just referral sharing it in your team. I think of this as referral as I learned something, I'm an expert in this new technology, and I'm excited to share it with more other people. I almost think of this as being nearly fully outside of the channel, where you've said, okay, I've done everything I can do here that was on the planned experience, and now I want to go above and beyond that. And so as we build effective developer experience, we want to make sure we have the ability to lift that ceiling so people can keep doing additional things and create new users of our tools who are going to have a great experience from the beginning and go through this same cycle. So a few techniques here. Collaboration features is a big one. Swag is another. I go back and forth. I tend to not need more conference t-shirts, but for some people, that really helps build in the identity of I am part of this community. One that I found is particularly effective is making it easy to prevent and share the work. One is just saying yes, it's totally okay for you to talk about this tool and share it with people. A lot of people don't want to do that if they feel like they're imposing or they might do something wrong for the company. But a lot of the time people are excited to teach either at a meetup or at a school or something like that. And so giving people things that lower that bar, be it a stock deck with your logo or just sample applications that are fun to build and share, that's great. This might be when you start an internal community to share your work and help others debug. You'll often find that a lot of support comes from within the group rather than just a dedicated support chat room or support email address. These are places where people really feel like they're helping others. And you might also build up internal champions who are excited about doing this work and bringing other people to it. So when you get to this part, this is really the top of that cycle, which is going to generate more from the beginning again, but keep people happy and engaged and able to do new things that challenge them and not just do the same thing every day. And certainly not just copy paste things over and over. So it's just effective developer experience, despite what all of our marketing says, despite what we claim, it's not about making things easy. Instead, it's about looking across the entire cycle of how we use our tools from the first moment we hear about them until the point where we become someone who's so excited about them that we want to teach them to other people. It's not something that's relegated to the developer relations role. It's something that all of us can build for ourselves, whether that's helping people find the right entry point into a tool, taking into account their learning style, making sure it's not too hard, not too easy. We disclose concepts over time. We give docs and error messages so users can solve their own issues. We allow people to customize towards the advanced mode, and we let people bring more people in. This is all about keeping us in flow as a full team effort. Developers don't want magic. We want to be able to be magicians. And so with that, I know we have our moderator who's going to pull in questions, and I'm happy to answer anything about the concepts or anything about the specific techniques that might be helpful.
Alan, thank you so much. Really interesting talk. And yes, we do already have a couple of questions. And to me, dark is a completely new thing and really sounds exciting. I was checking out the website. Can you talk about dark and how can we use dark? Can we use it with tools, or what are examples for dark usage? Is my question.
Sure. Yeah. I'm at Boldstart now as a founder in residence, so I might not have the most update date information. I know the beta has been open, so if you go to darklang.com, you should probably be able to use it. There's a bunch of videos I made on YouTube about integrating with different services. GCP is one of them. Slack is another. If then this, then that is another. Basically a ton of different webhook examples. But Dark itself is great for if you are building any web backend experiences. So think of that as API endpoints, workers that respond to an eventing system, cron jobs, or data storage.
Really exciting. I will definitely check it out, and I suggest everyone should check it out. And let's get to the first question. Istvan is asking, which is easier, get into the flow in an open space office or at home? What's your response to this?
I personally think it's much easier to be in flow at home. Actually, I'll throw in a plug for this. If anyone has been struggling to get into flow, there's a new tool that came out. It's flow.club, and it's groups of people who are spending time working together in chunks of time to try to accelerate the getting into flow process. It's a private beta, but I have some invites. So if you email me, I can send you them. But I'm like a work in silence person. And so it's much easier to get into flow at home.
Flow.com sounds... about what you said about the flow and this graph that showed where it's boring or it's either anxiety. I really felt that this came up several times, and it's good when you're in the flow, because then it's like you remember that. It's really interesting. Diego is asking, how do you measure the quality of the experience, the developer experience?
Yeah, this is it's gonna depend for every tool. But what I always try to do is I look for a metric that I am specifically tracking. So for instance, with Dark, when someone was onboarding, I would look at how long it took them to ship a service and how many endpoints they built in their first onboarding session. And so you're going to look for something that indicates that someone has done enough things that they really understand the tool. And so I think that's like one of the easiest places to measure effectiveness. And then I think beyond that, I think it would be more of a coupling of a quantitative metric with a qualitative sense. So the quantitative metric would be, are you getting good retention? Depending on the tool, something you want people using every day, you might look at your daily active users over your weekly active users. Is a pretty common metric people are using. But you also want the sense of, do people like it or not? So one tool people will use for this is NPS, which is why you get so many emails that are like, would you recommend this to a friend on a scale from 1 to 10? That's good if you're trying to compare across industries or you want something objective about it. But I do think that's something where you can have the qualitative conversations with your users and see, are they kind of like, I have to use this because it's the only option, or like my boss said I had to, or are they the people who are like rapidly evangelizing it to others? And so I wouldn't be afraid to have a qualitative sense coupled with a quantitative metric.
You mentioned NPS. What is NPS? I never heard about it.
Yeah. I feel like we're having like a joint developer/marketing talk, but NPS is Net Promoter Score.
Sorry,
and
again?
so it's a Net Promoter Score.
Net Promoter Score.
And so it's on a scale of you send someone a survey and you say, how likely are you to recommend this product on a scale from 1 to 10? And then you break it into buckets. And if someone rates you between a 1 and a 6, they're considered a detractor. If they rate you a 7 or an 8, they're considered neutral. And if they rate you a 9 or a 10, it's considered a promoter. And so you take the percentage of people who are promoters and subtract the percentage of people who are detractors, and that's your Net Promoter Score. Mm-hmm. So Apple's, for instance, is famously high. Most people rate Apple a 9 or a 10, so it's above 0 for sure. Companies like the internet provider service Comcast in the United States is known for having really bad customer service and also tends to have a very low Net Promoter Score.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Christian is asking, do you think modularizing a tool can help with the progressive disclosure?
Yes. I don't know exactly what you mean by modularizing, but definitely the idea of breaking something up so you either understand what primary use cases people are using your tool for and let them grow into different use cases over time, or the idea of having another concept I would add would be like the information architecture. So if you're just thinking about the menus and where things are located in them, figuring out how to sort those into different components can also be really helpful. And if you mean modularizing in terms of the actual underlying services in your own architecture, I do think it can help if it kind of keeps people on the same page about, oh, when I'm working on this part of the code base, this is the part of the user experience I'm impacting. And so it makes sense to have that matching of the two.
Thank you. Robert is asking, what was the best developer tool you got into? I think it should be Dark.
Yeah, I mean, I loved Dark. I guess I won't give you one tool, but I will give you one thing that I think is really important. And this was a big part of Dark, is I think it's really important to be getting real-time feedback on what you are building and how it's working. And so there's a whole bunch of tools that fall into that bucket. In Dark, we called it live values, but you could actually replay a trace. But it's very similar to REPL, where you can see the code you've run immediately, or a notebook. I'm a big notebook fan. Or like, honestly, if you're going to go further down that, I think observability tools like Honeycomb are really interesting as well.
Honeycomb. Yeah, our next speaker is going to be the CEO from Honeycomb by accident. Alan, thank you so much. I think if anyone